Samus It Ever Was in NES Works episode 48. Super Metroid, one of the most influential games ever created, debuted 25 years ago this month. The design and structure of that Super NES masterpiece have become a part of gaming's DNA, informing everything from big-budget hits like BioShock to quirky indie games by solitary designers working alone in their living rooms. But Super Metroid could never have existed without the 1987 NES classic, Metroid. And not simply in the obvious sense that one was a sequel to the other. Nintendo R&D 1 built Super Metroid literally around the bones of the earlier work. Both games were set in the same location, with much of the sequel's world repurposing the passages and placement found in its predecessor. While narratively presented as a sequel, Super Metroid in a lot of ways plays like a remake. It takes a promising and inventive creation riddled with flaws and frustrations and refines the entire thing to near perfection. That Super Metroid was able to rework a 1987 NES adventure into a genuine masterpiece speaks highly of the original game. Metroid certainly wasn't perfect, but it was every bit as vast and ambitious as its counterpart The Legend of Zelda, and it deserves equal veneration. Can you imagine Nintendo shipping two top-tier releases in such close proximity to each other nowadays? Zelda and Metroid debuted in the US mere weeks apart, following closely on the heels of Kid Icarus, a hat trick of next-level game design that, along with some ambitious third-party offerings like Castlevania and Rygar, elevated the entire concept of what a console game could be. If the NES black box launch lineup relied a bit much on Super Mario Bros. To demonstrate that Nintendo's new console was a step beyond the likes of Atari 5200 and ColecoVision, these new silver and gold box games assured us that Super Mario hadn't been a fluke. No console before had ever played host to anything like Metroid, nor for that matter had any PC. The NES was legit. Although the close timing of Zelda and Metroid's US releases might seem counterintuitive, why would Nintendo compete with its own products like that? It seems somehow appropriate. The two games represent two different takes on the same concept, the concept that Kid Icarus had flirted with, each uniquely expressive of the driving philosophy behind the internal studios that created each game. Zelda came to us from Nintendo R&D 4, Nintendo's fledgling division headed up by Shigeru Miyamoto, which is now known as Nintendo EAD. Metroid, like Kid Icarus, came from Nintendo R&D 1 under Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi was Nintendo's oldest superstar designer, and Miyamoto was its youngest. Still, it wasn't age or tenure that set the men apart, but rather the philosophy that drove their approach to game making. Miyamoto, a bit of a creative dilettante, came to Nintendo as an artist who saw games as toys. That's not toys in a childish or pejorative sense, but rather as creative play spaces in which players could experiment and express themselves. It's a mindset that continues to define Miyamoto's work to this day, and you can see it in action in the original Zelda. The Land of Hyrule treats players to a rambling, open-ended environment packed with tools and secrets, allowing them to explore at the pace of their own choosing and find their own interesting combinations of tools and techniques to advance. The term sandbox game didn't exist in any real sense in 1987, but that is what Zelda was. Somewhat literally, in fact, thanks to the top-down perspective that splashed the earthy and sandy pathways of the Hylian countryside across each screen of the overworld. By contrast, Yokoi made his name at Nintendo not as an artist or toy maker, but rather as the inventor of gadgets. His creations tended to focus around a single concept or mechanism, which he then harnessed to create a tool for entertainment. Yokoi's approach was less about creating a setting in which players could express themselves, and more about giving them the tools with which to do so. It's a subtle distinction, but a significant one, and it helps explain the central philosophical difference between Zelda and Metroid. Fundamentally, both games set out to accomplish the same basic thing: to create an action-driven interpretation of the role-playing genre. Zelda took a similar tack to Atari's Adventure and Namco's Tower of Druaga, presenting a top-down hack-and-slash adventure free of the fuss of fine details like experience points and leveling mechanics. Metroid, on the other hand, feels like a distillation of Kid Icarus's role-playing mechanics, which in turn could be seen as a simplification of previous works like Falcom's Sorcerian. Metroid is in no way an RPG, but it takes key computer role-playing components, exploration, skill growth, combat, loot hunting, and transforms them into a simple icon and tool-driven adventure that plays like a rambling, open-ended, sci-fi adaptation of Super Mario Bros. It's a natural progression from the turn and menu and party-based dungeon exploration of Wizardry to the real-time action and party-based dungeon exploration of Xanadu, to Kid Icarus's use of scoring for experience points, to the streamlined action of Metroid, though in Japan Metroid actually shipped before Kid Icarus. Metroid makes the transformation of RPG into action complete by removing Kid Icarus's overt RPG elements altogether. Protagonist Samus Aran doesn't even have an inventory screen to shuffle through like Link, Pit, and Rygar did. Yet, Metroid manages to be every bit as complex and expansive a game as its top-tier NES peers, because it gives Samus an absolutely massive world to explore while turning the bounty hunter's own body into both a weapon and a tool. Metroid encompasses all the playbeats of its action RPG counterparts: the exploration, the character growth, the constant acquisition of better gear with which to perform ever greater feats. What sets Metroid apart is the fact that all of these mechanisms are one and the same thing. Samus herself is both heroine, weapon, and tool. As Samus explores, she grows in power by collecting the gear upgrades she finds along the way. And as she gains upgrades, she also increases her ability to explore the underground passages of planet Zebes. The more she explores, the more she becomes able to explore further. It's a simple feedback loop, but a profoundly addictive one. There is a reason games inspired by Metroid have become an indie staple. By stripping away all the extraneous details like menus and inventory management and stat growth, Metroid places its feedback loop front and center as the core of its gameplay experience. It's the role-playing game stripped down to its absolute basics. Or, perhaps looking at things in the other direction, it's a pure Super Mario-style platformer action concept expanded to its most intricate extreme. Indeed, Metroid seems designed to build off the player's familiarity with Super Mario Bros. As I've written about before, the game begins by giving the impression of a standard side-scrolling action platformer. As in Super Mario Bros., Rush and Attack, and even Rygar, you begin by running left to right, avoiding and destroying enemies along the way. You can only make it so far this way before you come to a seeming dead end. In the third room over, Samus encounters a low-hanging wall, leaving only a gap too small to walk beneath. NES owners would have encountered a similar structure in World 1-2 of Super Mario Bros. So similar, in fact, it's hard to believe that the Metroid team wasn't inspired by that game. But where Mario could either run beneath the gap while in his unpowered up form, or shatter the bricks above it to create a path, or perform a running slide beneath it by ducking, Samus has none of these options. She can only run, jump, and shoot, and neither of these will get her past the obstacle. Instead, you're forced to backtrack to the opposite side of the initial starting point, where a power-up awaits just beyond the initial screen in the wrong scrolling direction. The placement of the item forces you to come to terms with the fact that you're going to be playing this game differently than you did Mario, which was an adventure that wouldn't even allow the screen to scroll backward. Even Kid Icarus used that style of ratchet scrolling throughout, meaning Metroid works like Kid Icarus's dungeon stages, but with the free scrolling of Mario. Anyway, this item hidden on the opposite side of the starting point is called the Maru Mari, and it allows Samus to duck, kind of like Mario, for whom it probably isn't named. Unlike Mario, Samus turns into a rolling ball when she ducks. In ball form, she can roll freely through the world. Ducking into a ball allows you to slip through narrow passages, and it also puts Samus in a kind of standby status that allows her to drop explosive bombs. Once she's added bombs to her arsenal, of course. Bombs work as both weapons, capable of damaging foes, and as tools that can shatter certain tiles in the floor and wall, revealing new passageways. Which is to say, the Maru Mari establishes Metroid's core premise of streamlined versatility by acting as both a weapon and as a tool. You see this philosophy throughout the game with practically everything Samus collects. The fortress beneath Zebes is divided into individual rooms, all separated by doors. Most of the time, these doors are blue and can be opened with a single shot of Samus's default arm cannon. But as you venture further into the maze, you'll encounter doors in other colors: red, orange, even hot pink. These resist Samus's cannon and are effectively locked. Because Metroid is not a game about juggling inventory items and hunting for keys, the secret to unlocking them is simply to make Samus's weapon more powerful. For this, you need the missile upgrades that are hidden throughout the fortress. As with the Maru Mari, the missiles serve a dual role as both a new attack option and the key to further exploration. Missiles pack a wallop in combat, capable of destroying creatures that are impervious to standard weaponry, while also allowing Samus to open any shielded doors she encounters. And so it goes. Each time you acquire a new piece of gear, you expand both your combat capabilities and your capacity to explore the world of Zebes. And you do this without the need to juggle equipment. The most complicated requirement of Metroid's arsenal is the need to tap the select button to toggle missiles on and off. This is not a perfect approach. The game allows Samus to upgrade her standard arm cannon to either the enemy-freezing ice beam or the wall-piercing wave beam. If you want to swap one for the other, you have to hunt down the requisite power-up icon within the actual labyrinth, which kinda sucks when you consider the fact that you can't actually defend against the strange space monsters that lend the game its title without the ice beam. Quibbles aside though, Metroid presents quite a remarkable feat of game design. Nintendo R&D 1 managed to capture the flow and character growth of a role-playing game within the context of a seamless action title. Metroid's heroine grows in capability over the course of the game, and players have to explore and experiment just as much as they did in Zelda. But here it's all presented as a pure action game. Metroid wasn't the first game to experiment with this approach. Western games like Pitfall 2, Montezuma's Revenge, and Aztec had flirted with the idea of exploratory platforming, although less perfectly. And here on NES, Rygar and Kid Icarus had already beaten Metroid to the punch, at least in the US anyway. In Japan, Metroid had shipped in the summer of 1986, just a few short months after Zelda, and well before any other worthwhile exploratory platformer appeared. Metroid was the game that opened the floodgates for what would come to be known as the Metroidvania genre. To be sure, this game feels primitive and limited compared to the works that would follow in its footsteps. Still, it's an impressive piece of work for the time. A bold attempt to create a fluid, Mario-style action game with the depth of an RPG or a Sierra-style adventure game. It doesn't belong to any of these categories, but it serves as a bridge connecting all of them. Again, the specter of Mario is a big part of what makes Metroid significant. This was the first exploratory action game to have been designed in the wake of Super Mario Bros., arriving in Japan about 9 months after that game. Mario's most important contribution to gaming might well have been the freewheeling precision of its physics. Game developers were collectively working to refine the way players interacted with their on-screen avatars throughout the mid-80s, and Mario's responsive, reality-defying jump physics were a revelation. Samus doesn't control nearly as well as Mario did. Her jumps are floatier, her landings are slipperier. But she gives players even more choice over how she soars through the air. And in keeping with the driving premise of the entire game, even this most basic platforming skill becomes weaponized by the end of the quest. The way Samus leaves the ground dictates how she leaps. If players jump from a neutral controller position, she simply hops upward and can be steered slightly to the left or right in midair. If she jumps while already in motion, however, she tucks into a tumbling acrobatic leap that gives her greater distance and allows players additional control of her flight arc. She gains even more freedom of movement once she acquires the high jump boots, which add height and distance to her jumps. But Samus truly comes into her own once you locate the Screw Attack power-up, a tool that rewards players for mastering the heroine's tricky acrobatics by charging her tumbling leap with destructive electrical energy. Kitted out with a Screw Attack, Samus herself becomes the most powerful weapon in the game, capable of destroying nearly every enemy in Zebes by simply jumping into it. Even the deadly eponymous Metroid parasites lurking in the Mother Brain's lair, which find themselves unfazed by standard weapons like missiles and wave beams, recoil from contact with the Screw Attack. It's the ultimate expression of the tools for play philosophy that drove Nintendo R&D 1. By game's end, Samus herself is the key to exploring and destroying her way to victory. On the next episode of NES Works, more songs about Brinstar and food.